Welcome to Hints and Guesses, my podcast. Kent here, special edition. We're in the middle of a winter storm here in Michigan that closed down the churches. So it's Sunday morning, November 30th. And instead of driving over to the little congregational church that I'm a part of, I'm sitting here in my office and I've got a sermon, a good old-fashioned sermon ready to go. What am I going to do with it? And I thought I'd at least try to give a version of it here on the podcast. Podcasts and sermons are close. They're not quite the same thing. There's something about the sermon, I think, that comes from the old world, the world of bards and storytellers around the campfire or in the center of town or on the edge of town. And it's kind of a combination of knowing where you're going and not knowing where you're going. That's how it is for me. I kind of make a little outline and here's the terrain I'd like to wander in, but it kind of has a life of its own, especially in a live setting. And the podcast, I suppose, is like that, but there's no way to read the room, which is most of what a good sermon, or I should say it's the part of the ingredients of a good sermon is reading the room. And there's a kind of emotional and spiritual content in the room that one is also trying to read, as much as listen to the muse, to the spirit, to what might inspire, to open oneself to be inspired. So I suppose in that sense the podcast and the sermon share some ground. So I want to try to give a sermon-ish thing here. And one of the great things about the sermon, especially, although it's changing now with the digital age, is that it's here today and tomorrow thrown into the fire, so to speak. Like it matters what you say and it doesn't matter. It's gone. No one remembers what you say. I mean, that's even true immediately after, where people come and tell you what you said and you think to yourself, well, I don't know if I said that. It kind of has a life of its own between the listener and the words and the one giving the sermon. But the great part about it really is that it is gone. It has an effect, but not in the way like a book does or an argument does. It's like it has a certain tone, and the tone has an effect, and then it's gone. Now, of course, people are putting them online, and you can find my stuff actually online as well. These sermons that I've given, and a podcast is similar in the feeling, I think, but it does live somewhere. It lives in the cloud, lives in the clouds. It can be accessed for better and for worse. Anyway, don't really know why I'm going on and on, not really getting right to it, which is what a good sermon does. So it's the beginning of Advent. Today is the first Sunday of Advent, the season of holy longing. So I want to begin by reading a poem here by Goethe. Maybe you know it. It's called Before the Beginning. God speaks to each of us as he makes us. God speaks to each of us as he makes us, then walks with us silently out of the night. These are the words we dimly hear. You, sent out beyond your recall, go to the limits of your longing. Embody me. Flare up like a flame and make shadows I can move in. Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final. Don't let yourself lose me. Nearby is a country they call life. You will know it by its seriousness. Give me your hand. This is the right kind of poem for this time of year, for Advent, for a waiting and a longing and an anticipation, for the light, for what's not yet been born in the world. And Rilke's advice, go to the limits of your longing. Really? Really? Is that a good idea? First of all, to find the fissure of longing in your own being, in your own heart, and to follow that down. Where does it go? Where are the limits? What's at stake in such a thing? I'll tell you what's at stake. Disappointment, confusion, unmet wants. To awaken longing is also to encounter the possibility of that longing not being met. In fact, that's probably what makes it alive, the unmet quality of it that pulls us forward or towards something. Part of us would rather suppress longings, and maybe that's a really strong part of some of us. Or we allow certain kinds of longings, especially ones that we know can be met. But the deeper longings, which I think Goethe is getting at here, we push away, we suppress, we ignore. Ignore, at what cost? See, longing like this is a risky way to live. It's to live without guarantees. Even Jesus said in the garden, "Not my will, but yours." See, that's an expression of his own deepest longings. I want something else. And then also a handing over. But what do I know? That's kind of my translation. I want something else, but what do I know? Most people ignore the longing in that prayer of Jesus, in that cry, in that lament, in that grief cry. Not my will, but yours. They can't hear the longing. They think it's about some kind of like a regimented, mechanistic will of God that is, laid out as like a puppeteer or something, instead of the wild unfolding that is the universe and the cosmos and the human heart and a single life. Life without longing is not life. I mean, you could even say it's at the core of evolution, where there's attraction and then connection and then a kind of evolving, a kind of newness is born. Without the longing, without the attraction, there's no life. And we're sent here, according to Goethe, with an ache to pursue the deeper longings, to flare up like a flame. Imagine, read it in a straightforward way. Imagine God saying, go flare up like a flame so I can get around, so I can move, so I can inhabit and live in the shadows of the world. This is not a boring way to live. This kind of longing, I think, that Goethe is speaking to here, co-creates the world. God is involved as a participatory dynamic. The web itself, you could say. Even the word belonging means to intensify longing. I mean, people use it almost in the opposite way. I'm really searching for belonging, and I believe people when they say this. People are lost and isolated and lonely and fragmented, and the village is gone, the community is gone, the church is gone for most people. And yeah, people, and the family is torn apart. Yeah, belonging matters, but there's something mysterious about the word belonging. The etymology is to intensify longing, to make a path toward, or to walk the path of longing. So longing, I think, has at least two faces. And we have our inner longings, what I might call the shape of the soul waiting to be born in the world, or our deeper essence waiting for incarnation. This comes out in when you hear people say things like, I want a meaningful life, or like my high school students used to always ask whenever there was a lull in class, what's the meaning of life? Well, they said it in jest, but also not in jest, deadly serious, What's the meaning of my life? What's the meaning of a life, of any life? And those inner longings, are a pathway toward the possibility that the soul, your unique shape, your essence, can be incarnated in the world. I've read this Goethe poem before on the podcast, and probably told this little story from James Hillman from his book, The Soul's Code, in which he tells a story of an extremely shy kid, extremely shy, so shy he couldn't even look people in the eye, and he would hide behind his mother's skirt. And one day, pretty early in life, he found the shape of his own soul as it came to be born in the culture as a matador, one of the most famous matadors in Spain, and hiding again behind the cape. This dance of play, of hidden and seen and hidden. The other face, so that's the inner longing. The other face of longing is cultural. The longings of a family, of your ancestors, known and unknown, of a people group, even of a nation. I think nations have different longings. You can feel it. I've been lucky where I've been able to do quite a bit of traveling, and you can feel almost like the color of a place, and because it's an embodiment of the cultural longings of a people. Even a language, you can hear a certain kind of longing in an accent and in a language and in the way words are structured and sentences are structured. And in other words, we're not born a blank slate. I mean that in two respects. We're not born a blank slate. There's a shape to our soul. And we do not come in tabula rasa. And we don't come in tabula rasa when it comes to an ancestry and a people and a language and a longing. And each year, of course, in Advent, we turn to the Gospels. It's the Christmas season, and what's hard to hear back in there is the longing, because it's sort of like, I don't mean to be rude, but it's kind of like, oh, it's Christmas time, let's just tell the story again and remember, But longing is at the very heart of the gospel narratives in the birth story. It's why else would wise men travel from the east, following a constellation, a star, a way of reading the cosmos? Or why would two young parents walk 100 miles? Or why would shepherds be rejoicing in a field after seeing a vision of angels, of messengers? Well, in part because the characters in the story, in the nativity story, had an ache, a longing for the world to be a certain way. Their own personal ache, I'm sure, but also a collective one. What got constellated in a certain word that is rarely used in the entire Hebrew Bible, and that word is the Messiah, Mashiach. It means anointed one. This longing for an anointed one. And that's a symbol, that's a metaphor. I think all people are drawn to images and symbols more than ideas, more than arguments. And so the image of an anointed one was carried in the collective psyche, so to speak, of the Jewish people. What the world could be. Listen to Isaiah. Isaiah is probably Jesus' favorite prophet. He quotes from him the most, I think, at least. But he's a prophet of longing. Listen to this central text in which the early Christian community begin to read the life, the birth, the life, and the death of Jesus through, listen to these words. The mountain of the Lord's house shall be the highest of the mountains. Which is funny if you've ever been to Jerusalem, because Zion, Mount Zion, is the lowest of the mountains that surround. You can hear it in other Psalms where it says, as the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people. So it's kind of like it sits down in a little bowl. The mountain of the Lord's house shall be the highest of mountains. All nations shall stream toward it. A kind of unification and healing of what is most divisive, our tribal natures. Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. Jacob, of course, is the one who had the courage to wrestle with God and have his hip wounded. And that's the real blessing. He says, bless me, and it's a wound. That's actually in the word blessing itself, which is related to blood. It's a wounding here. This is an aside. Isaiah doesn't say all this. He goes on, Isaiah, the Lord will teach us his ways so that we may walk in his paths. The law, or the Torah, is really what the text says. The Torah will go out from Zion. The teaching will go out from Zion. The word of the Lord from Jerusalem. The Lord will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many peoples. Do you feel the longing? All these disputes and arguments and boundaries and borders and codes of who's in and who's out. The dispute. God will settle disputes. And then the most famous line, they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. One nation shall not raise the sword against another, nor shall they train for war again. And they talk about a longing born out of a lot of difficulty, a lot of oppression, a lot of exile, a lot of disappointment. You probably know the story of the Jewish people, or in part of the Hebrew Bible. They had problems with the Canaanites and the Philistines and the Egyptians and the Hittites and the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Greeks and the Seleucids and the Ptolemies and the Romans. So the image of a Messiah, of an anointed one, of a king, had to do with freedom. And maybe the deeper freedom too, kind of inner freedom, not just external circumstances, but of course not to be separated from just the freedom to live on their own land and to worship their God and to be themselves. Who doesn't share this longing to be themselves? So the gospel stories here, they tell us something, I think. And when we listen to them, Christians have always treated the Gospels at their best, I think, as a living text, not as a history lesson. Not as something to prove or disprove the case for this and archaeological evidence for that. Forget all that stuff. It's alive. The stories are alive because the images are alive, the symbols are alive. And maybe a little context is helpful, but not too much. I used to be obsessed with context, and I actually kind of see it as a new literalism, and so I'm a little more suspicious of, if we just understand the context, then we understand the text, then we understand God. I'm like, wait a minute here. But there are two stories that we've combined, in the way the church has told the story in the nativity scene. There are two stories, not one. About the only thing that these two stories have in common is Bethlehem itself, the house of bread, the place where King David, the original king, was born. Everything else is different. And the two stories are from Matthew and from Luke. And Matthew, of course, is a disciple, and he had money, and he was Jewish. And his gospel is concerned with Jewish questions. It's full of quotations from the Hebrew Bible and sort of linking the life of Jesus with the Jewish tradition. And so to say that Jesus is born where King David was born, this matters on the symbolic level, on the level of image and of power. And of course, David is the youngest of the brothers, which is like a sub-theme in the Hebrew Bible. It's not where you expect. But in practical terms, there had been no single king since David ruled who ruled over all of Israel and all the tribes. Not since David. David unified the kingdom. That's the language that the Bible uses. And Solomon followed David, and shortly after his death, the tribes and the kingdoms were divided again. And they never recover, really, until King Herod. And that's what Matthew is concerned about, the story of King Herod. Herod convinces the Senate in Rome to make him king of Judea. And they say, okay. He sort of promises the Romans, look, you won't have trouble with this area of the world, which had been giving them trouble. And the Ptolemies and the Seleucids and the whatever. I don't want to go backwards in the list of all the people groups that made it difficult for the Jewish people. But he convinces the Senate in Rome, and they make him king of the Jews. And so in practical terms, Herod's the Messiah. He's the anointed one. He's unifying. He's ruling now autonomously. He's not even under the Roman Empire, which makes the second story slightly problematic. But maybe you can feel the power of that, not since the Babylonian destruction of the temple, really. Was there even a king in Israel? And certainly not in Jerusalem. So Herod is the embodiment of a Messiah, an anointed one. That's what he is. And so Matthew is telling the tale of two Messiahs. And Herod lived or had a palace in Bethlehem, which makes it even more intriguing. One of his most beloved palaces, called the Herodian, where he was eventually buried. He had very specific instructions for his funeral and so forth, and that's where he was buried. His tomb was discovered maybe 10 years ago on the side of the mountain. That is the Herodian. And so Matthew is ringing that bell. The tale of two Messiahs, one cruel and domineering, and the other born under the rule of a wicked king. The other Messiah slips through the fingers of the corrupt king. That's just like the story of Moses. Luke, on the other hand, is a Greek and not a disciple. And he puts the entire story under the empire of Caesar. And these aren't historians in the contemporary sense. So they're not, the way we think about history is certainly not the way they thought about history. But they were trying to tell the truth, definitely. But there's a bit of a conflict. Herod was a fully autonomous king, not under the Roman Empire, even though Rome gave him the stamp of approval. And Luke sets the whole scene under the empire of Caesar and under a census, saying, under Quirinius, the governor of Syria, who would have ruled this province under the Romans, it was time to count for taxation. Now, it doesn't make a lot of sense why people traveled. That's never made sense to historians. Why people needed to travel to... Sorry, I'm just plugging in my computer. A little slight interruption. Modern interruption here in this ancient story. But it doesn't make sense to travel. You don't have to travel for a census, but that's the way the story unfolds. That's how Mary and Joseph end up in Bethlehem. Whereas in Matthew, they're just living there. But he never mentions Herod. And why? Because Caesar Augustus is the one... is the king that is the counterbalance to the birth of the anointed one. And he's not just a king, he's a god. The empire itself minted coins with the image of Caesar and the words, Divine Caesar, Son of God. I've held one of these coins in my hand. So politics and religion were intertwined. Of course, they always were, but in a kind of potent and powerful way. And Luke tells a story that in a very tiny corner of the Roman Empire, thousands of miles from Rome, a child comes into the world, and angels announce the news from the cosmos, and the king is born in a stable. So what these stories share is that this new king, this new Messiah, this new anointed one, is born under threat, hardship, coercion, empire, taxation, difficulty, power. That's the child who will deliver. That's the hope. That's the promise. That's the longing. That's the ancient longing, to beat their swords into plowshares and not train for war anymore. Maybe someday a king will guide us in this direction. It's the child who, who will deliver. And the shepherds who hear the news. And the wise men who travel from the east, who understand. Teenage parents who are responsible for the new king and the new kingdom, which exist inside, hidden, inside, I don't know what you would call it, the dominant power systems. Okay, that's a summary of those two stories, and I want to come back to the word longing. No more war. Peace on earth, we sing this time of year. Freedom from enemies. These are the longings, in part, inside these birth stories, and they're half met. See, longing is, like I said, it's a risky way to live. And Christianity has a very different relationship with longing than, say, the Far East. And I'm not sort of criticizing an Eastern perspective, which essentially says longing is the very cause of suffering. And if we didn't long, if we didn't desire, if we could somehow relax and have no desires, we'd be free. But I think the Western tradition, the Greek philosophical tradition, and the Jewish tradition, and what emerged as Christianity has a much closer relationship with longing, activating longing. And longings are refined in the best of the Christian tradition, or clarified or rarefied, you could say. And it's right at the beginning of the story. The Messiah is here, but it's not what you think. It's what you wanted and not really what you wanted. Or it's not what you wanted and it's what you wanted in a deeper sense. It's met and unmet in a strange way. And okay, so maybe I want to start turning, toward a close here. Advent is not about looking back, I don't think. Not really. Not when we hear it through the lens of longing. Looking back is fine, but it's also kind of silly. You remember that Chris Farley skit from SNL where he would interview people, and one time he had Paul McCartney on. He's like, "Remember when you were in the Beatles? That was awesome." I think that is Christmas for a lot of people. Remember that time? It's sentimental. And sentimentality is boring, So what is it about? I think it's about being in relationship with longing and anticipation. That's what Advent is. Being in relationship with longing and anticipation for something to be born that's unexpected, hidden, out of the way, secret, and in a strange way, wildly ordinary. What could be more ordinary than the birth of a kid? Maybe this is a kind of cliche way of saying it, but Advent didn't happen as much as it's happening. It's a stance, it's a mode, it's a way of praying, it's a way of being. When we are attuned to our longing, the question is, are we going to risk longing? And it's not that all longing is pure. That's what I was saying before about the sort of, difficult relationship that Christianity has with longing. we can be off about something. We can be off about what we really want. People say, I just need to trust my desires. And yes, and we can also be honest. So it's more that our longings, I think, get purified when we have the risk, when we risk intensifying them, which is, again, the root of belonging here. It's that our longing gets rarefied or transformed, you could say. We suddenly see what we really want from the heart level in terms of soul and depth. So Advent, I think, is much more like a mystical reality, a place we inhabit than anything else. Which leads me to some questions. What might happen in our dark and hidden places? I think that's the pull of the heart and the soul and of the earth this time of year. What might happen in our dark and hidden places? What might happen if we dare to long and pray and love and express and hope? Even hope for a more peaceful world? What might be born again in the heart, in the stable of our lives? That's the symbolic reading of the story. What might be born again in the heart, in the stable of our life or of our lives? What might happen in Bethlehem? If Bethlehem rests somewhere in the heart, in the soul. I don't know if this is true. You test it out. But I think a lot of people, I might even say most people, actually believe that nothing will really change. My partner, my kids, my parents, the government, the schools. It's like we have very little hope. We might march in the streets or demand change or post things on social media, but sometimes I wonder if we actually believe that nothing will change. And this is starting to show up, I think, in even the way we talk about even our personal problems. You know, we're materialists, we're literalists in our culture, and we use phrases like we're wired. Well, we're wired for this or wired for that. That's mechanistic, that's materialistic. You know, our DNA means that we inherited, you know, it's in our evolutionary biological makeup. And of course the way we talk about, you know, who we are. I have ADHD, you know, I'm an Enneagram 4, I'm an ENTJ, I'm a, you know, I know we can carry these in a loose way, which I think is the right way to carry it, but we're more rigid. It's like, no, we're actually wired this way. Don't blame me. And all this labeling to explain the world and explain who we are, and meanwhile we chase all the mystery out. So I think Advent dares us to risk desire and longing for something better. I think Advent dares us to hope, despite the evidence. I think Advent dares us to wait for some new light in the darkest time of year. To wait, gestation, wait. I think Advent dares us to sing, in my view, the best song this time of year. O come, Emmanuel. You know, O come, God with us. That is a song of longing. And it's risky and courageous to sing such a song, God with us, as if it never happened. Or as if it might happen again. Before the beginning, God speaks to each of us as He makes us, then walks with us silently out of the night. These are the words we dimly hear. You, sent out beyond your recall, go to the limits of your longing. Embody me, flare up like a flame, and make shadows I can move in. let everything happen to you. Beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final. Don't let yourself lose me. Nearby is a country they call life. You will know it by its seriousness. Give me your hand.